Good afternoon. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'd like to welcome all of you to Election Watch 2022, 1 year out. The bios of all of our panelists today are available on the AEI event page, and there's a terrific handout there that will enable you to follow along with our AEI colleagues John Fortier's presentation on the governor's contest and Michael Barone's presentations on the Senate contest. After that, Henry will discuss Biden and Trump's strengths and weaknesses as we approach 2022, and Norm will look at the Democrats. Remember, send your questions to Samantha Goldstein at aei.org or use the hashtag AEI Election Watch. But first, a quick word, and this is a bittersweet one. Norm and I started the Election Watch program in 1982, and it has been a feature of every off-year and presidential election since. We, along with Michael Barone, will all be AEI Emeritus Scholars by the end of this year, and we are turning Election Watch over to a new generation of political analysts at AEI who may shape it in different ways. We're very proud of this program, not only its longevity, but also the fact that even though we disagree about politics among ourselves, we have always worked to be civil and to provide analysis grounded in deep historical understanding of politics, something that's very rare in Washington these days. So now let's get started. Each of our panelists will speak for 8 minutes. John, you're on tap first to look at the 2022 governor's contests around the country and also at redistricting. We want you to look ahead, of course, but a quick word about Virginia and New Jersey is certainly in order. Last week, Henry and our other AEI colleague, Sean Trendy, used the same word, terrifying, to describe the New Jersey results for Democrats. Do you agree? John.
Well, thank you, Carlin. And I do want to start with just some sense of what midterm elections or what last week's elections were, a kind of midterm elections are like. The simple point is historically, they are not good for the party in power, the party in the White House. And of course, if the president in the White House is less popular, they can be quite bad. Some simple notes from the past, really, there have only been 3 times since the Civil War where the party in the White House has gained seats. That was in 1934, before we had polling, 1998, and 2002. There, in those races, President Clinton, President Bush, 60% or over approval rating, very, very popular. They gained just a few handful of seats. In all the other cases, excepting 34, they have lost seats, and sometimes very large margins when you've lost many, many seats. It's true also in the state legislatures, where that pattern follows almost exactly. Only 2 of those elections have gone for the president in the White House. So I think the obvious point is, with the close margins, it's very hard to see midterm elections going well for Democrats. And if the word terrifying is used, I think the question is, well, what does Joe Biden look like next year in 2022? And that's going to affect both what I say about the governors and Michael about the Senate. A little bit less because there aren't as many of them, and certainly about the House and state legislative races, where if Joe Biden is where he was today or last week, where Democrats had a roughly 12% move against them from the 2020 election, that looks like a very bad result. So we'll watch how he's doing as the elections come up. The governor's races, this is the big year for governor's races, where we have 36 governors up. And we have a number term limited. I guess I'll boil it down to this. It looks like there's a relatively even playing field. 1 seat in Maryland, Larry Hogan has held that as a Republican. That is going to be very difficult for Republicans to continue to hold. Looks like a seat that really favors Democrats taking over it. I'd look at 6 seats that are competitive, 3 of each party, where you have Arizona and Georgia, 2 places where Republican governors ran afoul of Donald Trump, where in Arizona it's an open race. But also we can look at Kansas, a state where Democrats hold the gubernatorial mansion in a Republican state, as well as a couple of other places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, all held by Democrats, where Republicans may have some chances to pick up. So it looks like the playing field is relatively even, but again, if the wind is blowing in a very strong way that it did in this last week, that looks like it would favor Republicans. want to turn to redistricting. This is a year that is different than most elections because we're going to have a big shakeup in the number of the legislative districts, both state legislative as well as congressional districts. And because of that, we're likely to see more change. I think the big story is in 2010, Republicans had a very, very large advantage in being able to draw those maps. They controlled most of the big states. Of the top 10 states, they controlled Texas and Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, and North Carolina, all of them where they had basic control of being able to draw the lines. The Democrats really only controlled in Illinois, with California having a commission, and New York historically had been divided in the legislature. That has changed. It still looks like perhaps a small Republican advantage in some ways, but that number seems to be shrinking. They are now we have Democrats in charge of New York, a very large state, of course, also Illinois, but a number of other states down the line where they have ability to draw the lines. Republicans still have a good number. I would look also at apportionment. When apportionment, we were first thinking about how we were reallocating the seats to states. It looked as if it would be more beneficial to Republicans than it turned out. The last minute changes in the census figures in the last year or so, in the actual calculation, caused New York, Rhode Island, and some other Democratic states to not lose as many seats or a seat at all than it was expected to. It still apportionment had still a slight Republican advantage, with Trump states gaining 5 seats or so, and 2 seats to the Biden side, about a net of 3. That's pretty small change. And what I mentioned about the changes between the parties and who controls, we're not there yet. We haven't been able to see all of the results, but there are states where Democrats are more active and more drawing maps that are pretty favorable to them. We expect in New York, we see in Maryland and Illinois again. We see in smaller places like Oregon and maybe New Mexico, where Democrats are using their ability to draw the maps, which they didn't have 10 years ago, to be able to compete more with Republicans. So a small estimate is an even playing field, a relatively small advantage for Republicans, close to even. But if, again, the wind is blowing, what I think we should realize is that we are creating a bunch of new seats. We are creating seats that some incumbents aren't as comfortable in. We're creating some open seats. I do want to make 2 other notes about the redistricting, which I think are worthwhile thinking about. In the open seats, we certainly have a number of places where majorities are looking to shore up the close seats. I think you see that in Texas, where a number of Republicans over the course of 10 years had become much more vulnerable in the suburbs of the bigger cities. Their districts were trending Democratic. The plans in place look like they're going to help those Republicans, at least for the first few years of the decade. And so those become safer. And I think you see that sometimes on the other side as well, too. Democrats in Illinois and other places shoring up some of their incumbents. Some of the commissions, I think, will create some new seats. So I think you should look to California, Arizona, and to some extent Iowa, which is a partial commission state, as creating newer competitive seats that others can come in. The last thing I'll say about redistricting is this: we have had a history going back to the Voting Rights Act of African Americans getting greater representation in Congress, and seats, many of which were minority seats, being created for the African Americans to win in large seats. What we see is a good trend that in many places we have African Americans winning in seats that are not overwhelmingly Democratic. Large number of seats where a white majority, or at least not a black majority, are electing African Americans. I think what we'll see is 3 Republican non-majority African American districts represented by African American Republicans in this next House representatives, never mind the Senate, which could have 1 or 2 others. So there are a number of, I think, positive trends. I think the court is also looking to maybe step back a bit from some of its earlier jurisprudence. And finally, I do think you see Democratic safe African-American members of Congress willing to allow their districts to be a little bit more, not as densely African-American, and still win those seats in places where Democrats control the redistricting. And that's also contributing to this growth in the number of African-Americans, but especially in seats that are not dominant majority minority.
John, thank you very much. There's certainly a number of lawsuits pending. When do you expect redistricting to be finished?
Well, it almost is never finished because, of course, sometimes these lawsuits continue past the first time we draw the map, and they continue all the way through the decade. We are at the beginning, in a sense. I think we've seen at least the first drafts of a majority of states, and we have some sense of what they're going to look like. But our elections are coming up. We have primary elections that are going to happen next year. So the real final work of however the legislature or the commission is going to draw the lines are going to happen in the next 2 months. But you're right, there may be some challenges as well, perhaps some primaries pushback. But we really do have to have lines in place, preferably by the spring for those primaries, or sometimes there's some later primaries going forward. But we're within a few months of knowing at least the early outlines of that. But again, I think we could expect challenges throughout the decade, as we've seen in the past.
Thank you so much, John. And now, Michael, we'll turn to you. What, if anything, did the governor's contest tell you about the next Senate contests, and which are the contests that you're watching most closely?
Well, the governor's races in New Jersey and in Virginia, which were just held this past week, and which produced somewhat surprising results in both cases, particularly if you're looking at them from the perspective of a month or 2 months ago, provided some hint of where public opinion is now. We've got 34 Senate races up for re-election, and with the 50-50 split in the Senate between Republicans and Democrats, obviously even a one-seat game gives a possibility of a Republican majority or a Democratic majority that depends not just on every Democratic senator lining up on the same side of a roll call vote. We're living in increasingly a straight party line ticket. When you go back to the beginnings of Election Watch, which you referenced, Carl, and back to the 1980s, back to the 1970s when I was in the polling business, there were lots of split tickets. There were lots of Democratic senators elected from Republican states. In fact, after the 1984 election, in which President Reagan carried 49 states, almost every Democratic senator was elected from a Republican state. And there were Republicans elected from Democratic-held states. That's much less true today. So I think that the gubernatorial elections in Virginia and New Jersey were in the state legislative elections that head there, were a pretty good indication that Democrats are at least marginally weaker nationally than they were 12 months ago. They tend to corroborate and go in roughly in tandem with the decline in President Biden's job performance rating and with the results that we've seen in 2 recent polls for generic vote for the House of Representatives, which have shown 7- and 8-point advantages for Republicans. I don't remember ever seeing polls showing the Republicans that far ahead in that question, which has tended to favor Democrats. That they may just be outliers, and we will see later if that's the case. But that leaves most of our 34 Senate races not seriously contested. Basically, of our 34 Senate races, 14 are in states that Donald Trump carried by double-digit margins. 10 are in Democrat states in which Joe Biden carried by double-digit margins. I basically think that there's no sign that any of those races is in significant marginal territory. To that, I would add the state of Iowa, which is an 8-point Trump state, in which Charles Grassley is running again. Those who have been wagered money against Chuck Grassley have been winning elections, have been losing it for 64 years. He was first elected to the Iowa legislature in the Democratic year of 1958 and to the House of Representatives in the Democratic year of 1974. He's still getting up at 5 a.m. and running and doing his daily jogging, and he announced his candidacy there. I think he's going to be tough to beat. I note that some Democrats are hoping that a divisive primary or an unpopular Republican primary winner will put Missouri, a 15-point Trump state, within range. Some Republicans hope there'll be a spirited challenge against Michael Bennet in Colorado, 14-point Biden state. I think those look like very long shots now. So basically, we're seeing a nation that's a little tilted with the governor races being won by the Republican in Virginia, 10-point Biden state, and coming within 3 points of winning in New Jersey, a 16-point Biden state. But I think that in state races, you're liable to see more factors pertaining to the specific candidate or to state issues. And then in Senate races, we're looking at race numbers that are going to be very close to the president's, as we've seen in the 2016 and 2020 Senate races. So let's look at the single-digit states, starting with where Republicans are defending 3 or 4 open seats. In Florida, the one clearly non-open seat where Marco Rubio is running for re-election, it's +3. It was a Trump state by 3, which is a big margin for Florida, considering where it's been over the last 20 years. He's leading Congresswoman Val Demings by 7 points in the single poll out there. I think you have to say that Rubio is favored, but Florida is a close race. We have Ohio, an 8-point Trump state, once solidly pivotal. We've also got a contentious Republican primary there. That may result in a Republican nominee with significant weaknesses and a Democratic nominee from the old blue-collar area, Youngstown, which is probably the best demographic profile for a Democratic candidate. In North Carolina, a 1-point Trump state, Democrats reelected the governor in 2020. Republicans reelected a senator and had pluralities for congressional legislative districts in 2020. That's an open seat. That's obviously going to be seriously contested. Candidate quality can make a difference there, as a defect on the Democratic candidate in 2020 resulted in him losing his poll leads and losing the race. Pennsylvania, a 1-point Biden state, where Republicans just won 4 partisan judge races held statewide. That's a possibility. That's also was a seat where Pat Toomey, the Republican senator, is not running for re-election. You have the possibility of strong candidates for both parties there, and obviously up for grabs. And finally, the last Republican seat, that in single-digit seat in Wisconsin. That was +0 points for Biden, won by a narrow margin. In fact, it's been won by less than 1 point in 4 of the last 6 presidential elections. We don't know whether Senator Ron Johnson, an upset winner in both 2016 and 2010, is going to run for the election, looking increasingly likely. But those are all going to be close races. If the current climate continues, you have to say that Republicans would have an advantage, but of course there's no guarantee that the current public opinion climate is going to be changing. It's going to be staying the same. In the 4 single-digit Biden states with Democratic senators, we see some polling. And I note that in all the public polls I've seen, incumbents are running below 50%. But there's little clarity on most of the Republican nominees. And we are, again, we've got some close races, closer probably than was assumed at the beginning of this cycle, where there was a pretty widespread assumption that in Biden's states, the Democrats would have no trouble holding those seats. Now it looks to be more iffy. Two Biden seats that were plus 0 points Biden that he's been trying to relitigate, Arizona and Georgia. Democrats won short terms in those races. Mark Kelly has been leading the state attorney general and other candidates in polls, but the southern border and the big influx of immigrants, it looks like we're probably going to get an increase of 1 million on illegal immigrants this year in America. Might be a problem for the Democrats. A lot of Republicans would like to see Doug Ducey, the retiring governor, running. He hasn't indicated much interest yet, but that may change. In Georgia, we've got Raphael Warnock running. He's one of the instances that was referenced by John Fortier of a black candidate winning in a white majority race. I would point out, actually, that Congressman Andrew Young won a white majority district in 1972, which is 49 years ago. So it's not the first time this has happened. And that was in Georgia as well. But you've got, he's running even in one poll against Herschel Walker, former football player in Georgia, who has support from former President Trump. That has the potential for being another nail biter. Nevada, we've got, that's a Biden plus 2-point state. Catherine Cortez Masto has led in the single public poll over former Attorney General Adam Laxalt, who's the grandson and son of senators, as it turns out. We'll see if that looks like a close race to me. Seriously contested and a good test for Senator Harry Reid's organization and getting out the vote of those culinary union members in Las Vegas. Bad problem. One problem of Democrats, I think, is the toughest race is in New Hampshire, which was a 7-point Biden state, bigger Biden majority. But Governor Chris Sununu has been leading incumbent Senator Maggie Hassan in multiple polls since August by something averaging out about 47, 41. It's a bad sign for an incumbent. Both of these figures are very well known in this small state. Mr. Sununu has been elected governor in the last 3 elections that are held every 2 years there. And his brother was elected a senator. His father was elected governor in the 1980s. Maggie Hassan was elected governor in 2012 and 2014. So the fact that she's behind in some surveys now is not a good sign for the Democrats. It indicates to me that you're looking at a seriously contested race from 2 candidates who are well known and may have had positive impressions over the years, but not clear which one will do so. So I think that we've got a very indeterminate outcome here. We know that small, margins for multiple candidates can give one party or another a much bigger advantage in the Senate than almost anyone expected. Remember when the Republicans gained 12 seats in 1980 and won a majority in the Senate? You had a lot of astonished faces in Washington. When those seats came up 6 years later, and despite President Reagan's positive job rating, Democrats gained 78 of those seats and used their majorities to harass Reagan on IRA and Contra and push his successor, George H.W. Bush, to break his read my lips promise. So small margins in multiple Senate races, all leaning towards one party, can produce a big result. So I can give you plausible paths on these races to see a Senate with 54 Democrats. I can give you plausible paths to seeing a Senate with 54 Republicans. And at this point, I'm not prepared to wager large sums of money in either direction.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that very concise summary. And now we're going to turn to Henry Olsen. Henry, as many of you know, writes a daily column for the Washington Post, so he's tapping the public pulse on a daily basis, and he has been looking specifically at Biden and Trump approval. And what are you seeing, Henry, and what worries you the most going forward?
Going forward, I think you have to take a look at President Biden's poor ratings, but abysmally poor ratings among independents. That what we saw last Tuesday was roughly a shift of, on the margin, 12 to 13 points from Biden's margin, which is to say that if Biden won Virginia by 10 points, Youngkin won by 2. That's a 12-point shift on the margin. We saw that in New Jersey with 13-point shift, in Bucks County, where Democrats were ecstatic when they took county offices for the first time in decades. In their 2017 shift, Republicans won them all back on shifts over 10 points. In Nassau and Suffolk County, suburban New York, you saw shifts over 14 points. All of these shifts are in line with Biden's dropping approval ratings. That on election day, Biden was on minus 8 points on the Real Clear Politics average. That is a 12.5-point shift from his 4.5-point win. So the only thing that matters for Biden and the Democrats is how do you change that? But to change that doesn't mean exciting Democrats to vote, because most partisan Democrats voted. To the extent there was something that was going on with turnout, it was Biden leaning independents or people who voted for Biden last time but weren't motivated enough to turn out. The partisans voted, and you still see them getting pasted. And I think that's because of what's going on with independents, is that when you take a look at Biden's approval rating among independents, before Election Day, the 5 polls in the Real Clear Politics average that had crosstabs for independents had Biden down by between minus 14 and minus 25 points. That's landslide territory. The 2 polls that have been taken since Election Day are even worse, 25 to 66 among independents in the Emerson poll and 28 to 67 among independents in the USA Today Suffolk poll. And you can't really say that these are all potentially small sample sizes, because in each, the independents are between 250 and 350, which is smaller than you might ideally think, but they're not the small 70 to 100 person sample sizes that typically produce wide and unpredictable gyrations. The fact is, independents really don't like Joe Biden. And the question Democrats and Joe Biden need to ask is why. I think the fundamental problem is that the Democratic coalition, among voters, ranged from people who were moderates but not Democrats to the far left. The only thing they agreed on was opposition to Donald Trump. When you look at the Democratic coalition in Congress, it is significantly to the left of that. When you look at Democratic voter opinion, Democratic Party voter opinion, it is significantly to the left of that. And what they've been pursuing for the last year are an agenda that caters to the Democratic Party coalition, not to the wider voter coalition, in terms of both priorities, emphasis, and action. And when that's the case, it's not surprising that independents say, you don't care about what I care about, therefore I'm going to give the other side the benefit of the doubt. What should also scare Democrats is that Republicans, and particularly independents who don't like Biden, are not ascribing Trump's failings to the Republican Party. That we've been seeing Democrats try and paint the Republican Party as the party of insurrection and autocracy. And it's quite clear that the voters who decide elections, the swing voters, aren't buying this a nickel. They don't see the Republican Party as tainted by Trump. Now, that doesn't mean that Trump himself has a lock on the presidency if Biden's ratings are down. The 2 polls I talked about where Biden is abysmal among independents, Richard Nixon's territory, or George W. Bush after the financial crash territory, had Trump up by a couple of points over Biden. Some of the first polls that do a 2024 race that show that, but with 10 or 11% saying someone else. And when you look at the crosstabs, almost all of those people come from people who disapprove of Joe Biden. So even now, at a point when people really don't like Joe Biden, the independents don't like Joe Biden, they are very leery about giving Donald Trump another 4 years in the White House. So given that Trump leads all Republican polls by a wide margin, given that the most recent Echelon Insights voter omnibus poll says that more Republicans, by a very narrow, but still more Republicans, say that they are Trump supporters first, then Republican Party supporters first. This raises not a prospect of uniting voters in 2022 against Trump. I don't think that's going to happen for Democrats. It does raise the prospect that if Trump is on the ballot, even an unpopular Democratic Party can recoup a lot of ground as people decide that they may not want the Democrats, but they really don't want Donald Trump. The Democrats have a very difficult decision to make, and President Biden has a very difficult decision to make. To do the politically sensible thing would be to pivot to the center quickly. The problem with that is that it's very difficult to see how to do that without provoking an internal party conflict with progressive, who, if anything, think they've given too much already to back an agenda that is seen by independents as too far to the left. To move even more to the center would provoke an intra-party conflict that would include primary challenges to incumbents in 2022 and continue the Democrats in disarray narrative. But to cotton to them means to continue to tell voters in the middle that they're of lesser priority. And it's, to me, a insoluble problem for the Democrats. And I expect Biden will do what he has been doing, which is trying to teeter and totter in the difference between the two of them, but that hasn't worked for him. The question is whether it can work for him if news gets better, or can work for him once the Build Back Better Act or the Reconciliation Act is finally behind him. Yeah, that's something that time will tell. But the internal contradictions of the Democratic Party voter coalition vis-a-vis the Democratic Party activist and partisan primary voting coalition is not one that can be solved easily, and how they address it will determine a lot whether or not 2022 is another Republican wave like we saw on Tuesday, or something that looks more like the 2020 elections, both at the top of the ticket and all the way down.
Thank you very much, Henry. And let me remind all of you, if you can send your questions so that we can ask them when everyone's finished presenting, using the email of Samantha Goldstein at AEI.org or the hashtag AEI Election Watch. And please submit your questions. We already have quite a few, and we're looking forward to getting even more of those. Now, Norm. Henry raised the subject of intra-party conflicts. How deep are the divides among the Democrats? How deep are those splits? And what historical analogies do you see to the present moment? And do you think that the infrastructure bill or the social infrastructure part of it can really revive Biden's fortunes? Norm.
Thanks, Carlin. One of the things that I've learned over our many decades is not to make linear projections about a climate at one point in time and where it might be a year later. And I want to emphasize, just looking back at Tuesday, I think what's been underemphasized here is the impact of COVID. We went through almost 2 years of turmoil, with schools closed in many cases, with jobs in disarray. And just when we thought we were coming out of it, Delta hit. If I look at Virginia, I think that while the schools and education made a huge impact, and certainly as we saw with those non-college educated white women, that it was the school closings that disrupted their lives enormously, more than critical race theory, that made a difference. And so I just want to add a caveat here. If Scott Gottlieb, our colleague at AEI, is right, and now with 81% of adults vaccinated, we may be moving past this, and with the economic impetus that's likely to come from the physical infrastructure plan, plus what might come ahead, we might see a very different climate, and one where independents and Democrats, if not Republicans, might view the Biden administration in a different light. There's no question that there's deep divides and some divisions on the Democratic side. But I think we also have to keep in mind that with a 50-50 Senate and what for most of this time has been a 3-vote margin in the House, they managed to get an almost $2 trillion American Rescue Package done at the beginning of the Biden administration, and now have managed despite losing 6 Democrats, and I can guarantee you that Nancy Pelosi had a few in her back pocket if she needed them, they managed to get this additional $1 trillion physical infrastructure plan through. In a nod to our former colleagues, Jim Glassman and Kevin Hassett, the Dow finally did hit 36,000 with tremendous growth there. But obviously, there's still tremendous turmoil in the economy. And with this narrow margin, the big question that you raised is whether they're going to be able to get, as the progressives who were quite pragmatic in basically saying, we'll take this leap of faith and hope that the 2 in the Senate who have been balking at moving forward with the big reconciliation plan, what would be another probably $1.75 trillion in programs, will come along and will actually get that done, presumably voting on it by next week or at least the week after. If that happens, and if it does go through, we're talking about almost $5 trillion in pretty dramatic change and spending. Now, many of my colleagues and others will say that that's moving an agenda veering far off to the left. But if you look at the approval ratings for things like universal pre-K, child care, child tax credit, home health care, they're very strong across almost all groupings. Now, think about it in terms of huge federal spending, and you're going to get a very different response than if you parse out the individual programs. Certainly, one of the problems for Democrats is that the messaging, as one of my friends has said, the Democratic bumper sticker reads, continued on next bumper sticker. They're unable to get those messages across. Whether they're able to do that is going to be one of the most important questions. I think it's also important for us to focus on the next element that would be in their plans, which is the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And we can talk about these elections in 2022 and moving ahead to 2024 as if they would be pretty much in the same territory as the previous elections that we've had. But the way in which elections are being reshaped in many states, giving more and more power to partisan actors to be able to get rid of election officials or shape the nature of the vote, could be altered very significantly if they're able to make those things happen. And obviously, that would require some change in the filibuster rule, which is not out of the question, but is certainly going to be a heavy lift for them. I just mentioned one other thing before we go, which has been, to me, very striking, almost astonishing. We've seen 50-50 Senates before. And of course, we've seen 50-50 Senates change so that the other party takes over a majority. We saw that happen, of course, when Jim Jeffords moved from Republican to independent and caucused with the Democrats, profoundly altering the trajectory of policy for the Bush administration. At any day, that could happen for Democrats. And also, of course, with these narrow margins. And what's been striking to me is that the Senate has operated as if it were a typical year, taking its usual recesses, going on recess now, not being around much on weekends, Mondays or Fridays. It's slowed down the confirmation process. It's left them in this position where the end game on that physical infrastructure bill extended beyond Tuesday instead of giving at least enough of a boost that it might have put in a close race Terry McAuliffe just a little bit over the finish line, where we'd be talking about today in a very different way. And I'm puzzled, in fact, that we have not seen either the administration or the Chuck Schumer-led Senate behaving with a sense of urgency that it would seem to me, given the nature of our overall political climate and the margins that they have, absolutely urgent for them to behave with a different timeline. Whether that changes or not, I'm not sure. But frankly, if they can get through the next few weeks and manage to accomplish that $1.75 trillion reconciliation package, put all of that together And leaving the voting rights issue aside, I don't think they have to do very much through the remainder of the year and just hope that the economy and the trajectory, including COVID, change so it would put them in a much more favorable place by next November.
Thank you very much, Norm. You and I have talked many times over the years about Nancy Pelosi. An assessment, at one point we thought she was a better inside player, and now we recognize that she's obviously an incredibly successful inside and outside player. Talk about her successors. I mean, she has said she would step down.
And I'm not sure if it looks like they may win another term in the majority, she might decide that it's better to stick around. The single most likely successor to Pelosi, and it will be a very difficult pair of shoes to fill. And remember those shoes, very high-heeled ones in which she stood at one point for 9 hours on the floor of the House debating. The single most likely is Hakeem Jeffries, the chair of the Democratic caucus in the House, a very articulate, savvy, and persuasive member of the House from New York, an African-American man. Obviously, given where we are for Democrats, not only will it be a difficult set of shoes to fill, but it's also going to be a question with not just minorities, but women on the rise as powers in the Democratic Party, whether moving from a woman to a man as the leader of the party is going to go over well. There are plenty of other contenders. We actually have a lot of young, attractive members of the House on the Democratic side. But you can be attractive and quite effective as a legislator and not necessarily be leadership material. So my guess is we're going to see a sizable change in the leadership ladder, the top three leaders, all in their 80s. But more than likely, it would be Hakeem Jeffries at the top.
Thanks very much, Norm. I wonder if each of you have questions for the others on the panel, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Don't be silent. Well, we're going to turn to audience questions. And the very first one is from a good friend of this program for many years, Whit Ayers, who's the president of North Star Opinion Research. And here's Whit's question. If the 2024 presidential election is a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump or Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, what are the prospects for a credible third-party candidate? Who wants to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I don't think very high right now. With Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who were the two most unpopular nominees each a party had put forward in quite some time, you only saw about 20% of Americans who had an unfavorable opinion of both. And that is the voter pool from which a third-party candidate would draw. Right now, Trump, according to the Real Clear Politics average, Trump and Biden have nearly identical favorability ratings, roughly 42.5% positive, 50-something negative. But that still means, given that Democrats like Joe Biden and Republicans like Donald Trump, that there's only about 15% maximum that may dislike both. And that's just not enough ground for a third-party candidate. You'd have to see abandonment by party activists or strong normal voters who are not activists of both parties' nominees, so that both of them would be somewhere in the 30s, where I think you would have enough of a voter pool that a credible third-party challenge could emerge. Right now, it's just not there.
Any others? Michael?
Well, I would say that Henry's citation of 2016 is on point. You had an opening there. I think also the kind of third-party candidate that might emerge is likely, and to get attention and particularly coverage in the press, is likely to be one that will go in the quadrant, if you can divide the electorate, of conservative on economic issues, liberal on cultural issues. And if you divide the electorate into four segments that way, that's the least heavily populated of the four segments. I don't think there's room for a sort of candidate of that's less less conservative on economic issues, and because Donald Trump basically occupies that quadrant. So I really don't think so. I mean, I wrote a book recently about how our political parties have changed and how they've stayed the same. They've been around a long time. The Democratic Party dates to 1832, the first Democratic National Convention. The Republican Party dates from 1854. There's a reason that there are multiple reasons that these two parties have remained there. And while you can get voters to say, as they say about lots of parts of the BBB measure and so forth, oh gosh, that sounds like a great idea, they don't actually act on that assumption very often. And I think that we're not going to see a third party any more significant than, remember him, Evan McMullen in 2016.
I would add a couple of things. First, one key here is what kind of primary process we have. How divisive is it going to be? If it's Kamala Harris, does she have a series of challenges from inside the Democratic Party, from others who see her either as weak or having a lot of issues that wouldn't work? A divided party makes it more likely that you'll see a third party candidate from one wing of that particular party. I would say the same with Trump. Are there going to be other contenders? Is there going to be divisiveness? But I would also say that while in 2016 we had clearly the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, it was the Green Party and Jill Stein who had a huge impact on the results in that election. I would guess that if we do get a third party that might have an impact on the results in 2024, it's going to be more on the right. It's going to be an anti-Trump kind of party that would have some appeal to suburban voters in some of these states. But I agree with my colleagues that at this point, I don't particularly see it if those are the nominees.
Well, we would get a candidate under 78 years old, I suspect, if we had a third party.
Michael, let me turn to you for the next question. And I think we all know that the polls were pretty close in Virginia, but they were off by a mile in New Jersey. And the highly regarded pollster Patrick Murray of the Monmouth poll actually apologized to both candidates and suggested perhaps that election polling should end. I wonder what your thoughts are. You've been in the business and it's changed a lot since you were a pollster.
Well, it's, I was in the polling business back with Peter Hart in the 1970s, going up through 1981. It turns out that polling has been alive a lot longer since then than it was at the time that I joined Peter in the polling business. It's been around only 40 years. So I think Patrick Murray does not owe us an apology. I went back and looked at the numbers in the Monmouth polls that he was the supervisor of, and they showed the incumbent governor with Phil Murphy with 51% of the vote. Guess what he got? 51% of the vote. And he got it in a state that has typically had low information because New Jersey is stuck between, the local news is based in New York, it's based in Philadelphia that they get on TV, on radio, and so forth. The opponent, Murphy, was well known for being in office for 4 years. And the Republican candidate, Jack Ciattarelli, was a guy who'd been a former state legislator. Well, when that campaign started, how many persons on the street could have knew anything about Jack Ciattarelli? Basically, in that kind of a thing, one interpretation of the polls is to say, gee, the well-known incumbent governor is going to get about what he's polling. And if the opponent is not some kind of a fraudster that is exposed before the election, he's going to get pretty much all the rest of the votes. And that's pretty much what happened. So I don't know that the New Jersey polls were actually so wrong. I would say that considering the problems that we've had with the smaller number of people that respond, with the fact that you're trying to deal with cell phone numbers that pollsters have had as financial incentive not to call, which people are, primed not to answer with vote, number identification. I think that those polls turned out to be pretty much on the mark. We saw the Virginia polling numbers change as Glenn Youngkin made an impression on voters, and as Terry McAuliffe made an additional impression on voters, to the point where they both became known pretty well and on substance. And those results make sense as well. So I asked Mr. Murray to withdraw his apology and to stand up for his polling numbers, which I think were entirely defensible.
Norm, John? No thoughts?
Agreed.
Norm, this is a question for you about the number of House retirements that we've had on the Democratic side at this particular point. Is it unusual at this point, given the number? Are we a little bit behind what the average is overall? And does that sort of spell impending doom?
I don't think it necessarily spells impending doom, but what we have to remember that when you've got a margin this close, every seat matters. And when you get incumbents in races that could be very tight, with the caveat that redistricting is not done, I'll mention Ron Kind in Wisconsin as one. You create more vulnerabilities. It is usually the case that when you're approaching an election where where one party is not likely to do as well as they would like, or thinking that they might lose the majority or not pick up the majority, you get more retirements. You think about whether you want to continue in this job. It also, there's a little bit of a contagion effect. When one individual says, I'm going to retire, friends and colleagues look at themselves and ask whether this is something they want to continue doing. And frankly, neither the House nor Senate are particularly warm places for a work environment right now. So I expect we're going to be seeing more, but we have to remember that the number of marginal seats is still relatively small. Some of these retirements aren't going to matter very much in terms of which party will take over a majority. But, it's a kind of a canary in the coal mine thing as we watch and see whether there's a flood of retirements. We certainly saw that in 2018 as one indicator of where the elections might go.
Anyone else have a comment on House retirement or Senate retirements?
Well, the House retirements have been they've been fairly high so far. I think that one of the factors is that when you're in the majority party and you got a majority of 3 or 4 seats and the president's job rating is plunging down towards 36 points, it looks like you're going to be in the minority. And the minority in the House is not a very fun place to be, particularly when you're used to shaping legislation, when you're used to playing an important part on issues as a member of the majority. So I think we're going to see somewhat more. And, if, and it's always an if, the current standings of the parties and the standing of President Biden continue to be in place. I took a look at the present seats in the House. You have 37 Democrats in seats that were produced the smaller percentages for Joe Biden than he won in the state of Virginia. You have an additional 23 Democratic members in seats that produced a smaller majority for Joe Biden than he won in the state of New Jersey. Now, I think that what you're going to see in redistricting, as John Fortier made clear, is that both parties where they have control will try to strengthen their incumbents and produce fewer marginal seats overall, fewer marginal Republican seats, fewer marginal Democratic seats. But if you're looking at numbers like 37 and 23 districts, even if you discount that a lot, as I would, that means that there's a lot of vulnerability there for Democrats if the current status of opinions takes place. So we'll see as things go on. We start getting filing deadlines for state elections, I think, in December. We'll see more of those as they come along. As the months go on, some of the states don't have filing dates till the summertime. But I think that we'll probably see more Democrats saying, as Sherry Bustos, the former chairman of the DCCC, said, it's time to go.
Okay, this was an interesting question. Youngkin didn't run a single anti-Biden ad or really an anti-Democratic Party ad. Does that suggest that he didn't want to nationalize the election? And are all politics now local?
I don't think politics are local. I think this was clearly a referendum on the party in power. It was across the country. It was in different states. It was, a pretty big margin everywhere. But I think Glenn Youngkin had both he didn't have to say that he was running against Joe Biden or the party in power in Democrats, but he also was trying to play a little hands off with Donald Trump in Northern Virginia, at least. And so, I think by focusing more on Democrats are in charge, it's a Democratic agenda. There are things that have gone wrong. We feel terrible. I agree with Norm that the COVID overhang factor was putting the electorate in a sour mood. And of course, the party in power, takes the blame for that. And I think that's the reason why he didn't have to call out Joe Biden, in part because he wasn't calling on Donald Trump as directly as he might have.
Well, Norm's point on COVID, I thought was a very cogent one. And, Terry McAuliffe is, after all, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee and one who's denied that the elections of 2000, 2004, and 2016 were fairly counted. He's got 3 more in his sights than Donald Trump does. He had as his guest speaker at his last event, Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers, who's been fighting to close schools, and which has led, as Norm, I think, made point, to a lot of discontent on a lot of parts of parents. You go to other countries, you go to other states, and you find that the schools have been running with basically zero health problems. So the teacher unions and their allies in the Democratic Party may have played a part in this. Politics those were local issues, but I also note that, McAuliffe's percentage of the vote looks a lot like President Biden's job rating in Virginia current polling.
Good. Here's another question, and I should point out that Terry McAuliffe was a student of Norm's when he was a professor at Catholic University many years ago. But this is a question about the economy. And by the way, Henry is having some technical difficulties, and perhaps we'll get him back before the end of the program. This is, any thoughts about the possible red flag effect of the recent weak GDP and also the increasingly negative international trade balance reports taken together with the significant tax increases that will be part of the Build Back Better legislative agenda? And I'd like to add to that just rising concerns about inflation and the potency of inflation as an election issue. Thoughts about the general economy overall? And Norm, should we start with you?
Sure. Here we have a question about whether the stimulus that will come with the infrastructure package itself, which depends on how quickly they can move those programs out. But one of the striking things about this bipartisan infrastructure plan is that they've streamlined the process enough that it's not going to be quite like the Obama stimulus, where it took so long because of all the permits required. We get that out there, and I know that our Jim Pethokoukis pointed out, using Mark Zandi's figures, that we're looking probably at a GDP moving at a 3.2% rate or more, which is pretty robust going forward. How quickly that kicks in and what it means for people remains to be seen. And whether that will lead to that continuing rise in inflation, some of which is because of these supply line problems, whether the supply line issues will be resolved. Those are big questions heading towards 2022. Still a year to go. But if we have a weak GDP and higher inflation, that would be the worst possible news for Democrats looking to next November.
Sounds something like the 70s.
Obviously, we don't know what the economy is, where the economy is going to be next summer. But I think, like Norm's earlier comment about COVID, if you think about the Biden presidency, when Joe Biden came in, it looked like he was in the best of all worlds. We had a vaccine. We were going to put it in place. It was going to put COVID behind us. The economy was going to snap back. And, that really helped Joe Biden through the early summer. When people realized that it was just not going to happen that way, it was slower. We were having a new wave, that the economy was good in some ways, but worries about inflation and the jobs they have in another way. That put people back in this kind of sour mood. So again, it looks like we are going in the right direction and things will be better. But will things be the same? Will it snap back, or will it be kind of a slow movement in the other direction? I think that's the real question. We don't really understand just from the GDP numbers what people are going to be feeling about the economy after COVID, or whether we're going to sort of gently get back to where we were rather than sort of a robust recovery, which would certainly be helpful to Biden.
Well, one of the things that strikes me as interesting is that we seem to have had the same policies at the federal level, from requirements, mask requirements, all this sort of stuff, with response to COVID. After the vaccines have appeared and after the threat of death from this disease has been vastly reduced. And we're in some parts of the country, we're masking pre-K kids whose risk of dying from this disease is basically nil. And so forth. We have we have alternate policies that have been followed in some states in our federal system, most visibly represented by Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, against whom, interestingly enough, the Democratic governor's campaign outfit has announced it's not going to spend very much money. That's in a state where a 3-point Trump win looked like a comparative landslide next to some of the other margins in the presidential races. So I think that to some extent it depends on how we keep treating this. Are we going to continue to have school closings? Are we going to continue to have various requirements now that the disease is very much less deadly? And the announcement that we've seen of new medicines apparently coming on the market, which are used, which seem to have efficacy in vastly reducing deaths and hospitalizations among people who are infected with this disease. That might have the potential of making this disease not much more deadly than influenza has been in any recent decade. That may change the attitude, but there's obviously a feeling highly correlated with partisan leanings on the part of Democrats to restrict people's activities, and on Republicans to going in the other direction. And I'm not. I don't think we've seen how that is going to play out.
Yeah. It was interesting, Carlin, that Dave Leonhardt of the Times has an interesting study out today that for this past year, the deaths are 3 times greater in red counties, those that supported Trump very handily, compared to those that supported Biden. So these alternative policies that Michael mentioned have not helped much with COVID, but they don't seem to have hurt much politically, and perhaps they won't. As we're seeing in Florida. I just want to note, Michael, that the reason you use masks for young children is not because they're likely to die from COVID. It's that they might transmit it to others with lesser immunity who might be infected. So there are other reasons for masks, but the anti-masking movement has clearly been a mobilizer.
Yes. Now let me, before we turn to the final 2 questions that we have on the board here, let me thank Samantha Goldstein. She's been an absolutely wonderful assistant for all of us in helping to organize this program. And we've also had 2 terrific interns, Lucas Piamonte and Catherine Whiteside, who've really helped us through this semester very much. But here are the 2 final questions, and each of you can take the one that you'd like. First, please contrast the impact of a right-wing candidate like Winsome Sears versus a Kamala Harris, or a Tim Scott and Marco Rubio versus a Nikki Haley. Do you think they can draw a crossover vote? Someone like Winsome Sears in particular. Yeah, I should point out that Kamala Harris' number in the new USA Today poll out this morning was 28% in terms of her overall favorability. Any thoughts on that question? About a crossover?
Well, I think that increasingly voters are evaluating candidates as individuals, at least in the cases where they get to know something about those candidates. rather than as, hey, it's the black candidate, it's the white candidate, it's the ethnic candidate, whatever. We are more open to voting on the basis of those individuals. We've certainly seen this in the performance of Tim Scott in South Carolina in a positive way. We have seen it. Remember that he won his first big victory that propelled him to Congress by winning a Republican primary in a large majority white congressional district, including against one of the candidates was son of the late Senator Strom Thurmond in South Carolina. What we've seen also, interestingly enough, and I'm not sure I predicted this, I'm not sure almost anybody predicted this, we've seen increased percentages for Republican candidates among Hispanic voters. Even at the same time, we've seen increased percentage for Democratic candidates among high-income white voters. We've seen that dynamic playing out, and one thing it isn't is that is not a matter of just voting on a matter of race and so forth. I think we've also seen black voters vote more for slight increases in willingness to vote for Republican candidates. Youngkin of Virginia and the exit polls seem to get 13%, which is, more than recent Republican presidential candidates have raised. And we saw Donald Trump do slightly better with blacks and substantially better with people self-classified as Hispanics in the last election. So, those categories change over time, and people are willing to cross racial lines. One of the things we've seen change in the Voting Rights Act jurisprudence and in the reaction of politicians of both parties to it is that a lot of the old assumptions in the Voting Rights Act were white people just won't vote for black candidates. Well, as one of the earlier speakers noted, that ain't true no more. Lauren Underwood, a Democrat in Illinois, 14, Burgess Owens, Republican in Utah, 4. You've got the candidate in Naples, Florida. People are willing to vote for people of different ethnicity and different racial categories. And that's obviously a good thing.
Yeah. There's one final question, and this asks all of you to try to reconcile a different point of view between Henry and Norm. And the question is, what are the best politics for the more moderate Democrats in terms of whether or not to vote for the reconciliation bill? Norm suggests that the bill is full of policies that poll well with independents, but Henry's been arguing that the agenda doesn't appeal to voters beyond liberal Democrats. What's the answer? And so we'll let John take a shot at that.
Well, I think they're in a very difficult position, these members of Congress. There aren't so many of them that are probably in that difficult position. I guess I would say this. I think it is, given the narrow majorities, it is very difficult for most of members to ultimately be the ones who would bring down a bill. And even though I think they could pay for votes in moderate districts for the Build Back America Act, they certainly could. They are often better off sticking with their party because they have obviously the problem of a primary challenger, just the problem of seeming weak. And so I think there are very few members. I mean, Joe Manchin is a senator, one of them, whose state is so different than almost any other place that the Democrats represent, a 40-point Trump victory in West Virginia, that his needs and his changes that he needs to the bill are more connected to the fact that he's from a very, very different type of place. But for others, I just think it's very difficult to be a moderate Democrat and be seen as going against your party, the ire you get and the weakness that you bring. So you may end up going down with the ship if things don't go well. But I think it's a really risk that if you don't vote with the party, you'll face other types of trouble. Norm or Michael, a final word?
So I would say this: if I were giving advice to, say, Alyssa Slotkin or Abigail Spanberger, two House Democrats who've been in very tough districts and are running again, and they've taken different stance on this larger bill, the two of them. But I would say, first, what John said, if you are seen as a party in disarray and you don't accomplish things, you're going to have an uphill battle that becomes even more uphill. I would be delighted to go back home and say, those of you who found that you have two parents who have to work and you need childcare, and you're finding that when you get childcare, it uses up all the money you're making while you're working. Now you're going to be able to get that childcare and go to work, and you're limited to 7% of your income. You know how your parents are developing Alzheimer's and there's no place to put them, and you're going to have to take care of them, which may mean you lose your job. Now there are opportunities for home health care, which also will provide jobs. You know how you've been struggling with income? Here's that $300 a month in child tax credit that's going to keep you afloat a little bit longer, even as it reduces child poverty. I think those are winning things to run on. And if you can make that case in a way that meets the test, that you're not just doing it for poor people, you're doing it for working class people, and you're doing it for middle class people, you're going to have broad appeal in those districts. And if it happens, you're much more likely to prevail.
Well, so of course, you're going to get some of the Democrats going to ask in a position for those modest income districts to cast a vote for increasing the deductibility of state and local taxes, the benefits of which go primarily to people over $700,000 and so forth.
Which is being pushed by the moderates.
Norm, I didn't interrupt you.
Progressives.
Don't interrupt me. No, I mean, it's being backed by people who are in districts with a lot of high income people and high taxes and high public employee unions keeping spending high in those local states. That's a winner for some people like Josh Gottheimer. It's a real loser for some other people. And so I'm not confident that the case there that Norm has made, which, is the case that I suppose that somebody in that position that votes for that bill might want to make, is going to be very helpful in the long run. And I think those candidates would be wise to have some plans in mind for what they might want to do otherwise professionally next year.
Well, I want to thank you all for a wonderful session today. As you can see, we do have differences among ourselves, and that I think has been a strength of this Election Watch program. And it's nearly 40 years. It's been a great run. Thank you so much for watching, and you'll see a new Election Watch. Perhaps John Fortier will be running it going forward, and perhaps he'll invite the rest of us back. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlin, for all of your leadership over these years.
Yes, thank you.
Hear, hear.